Who are the Falcons going to take in round one this year? I don't think we have to dig too deeply on it because I've done all the homework for you and boiled it down to just 5 players.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the most humble host that has existed in this galaxy, and especially on the planet Earth, the third rock from the sun, hosting this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, guys, later on today's episode, we'll take a deep dive on 2 of the players that I think are in the Falcons sort of top five list of potential prospects. But ultimately, what we're going to be talking about is I don't think we have to overthink this, right? I've seen a lot of people throw out various names on who the Falcons could take in round one. You see Devin Witherspoon, the Illinois corner, Nolan Smith, the Georgia pass rusher, Peter Skoronski, the Northwestern offensive lineman, Paris Johnson Jr., the Ohio State offensive tackle, Lucas Van Ness, the Iowa pass rusher, Broderick Jones, the Georgia tackle, Quentin Johnston, the TCU wide receiver, Jackson Smith and Jigba, the Ohio State wide receiver. And I just sit here and I go, like, you guys are just throwing darts at the board, right? It's not going to be one of those guys. And let me say up front, I don't know who the Falcons are going to take. I'm just guessing, right? But I feel like it's educated guessing, right? And that education comes from 2 years worth of data, and maybe that's not enough of a data set to really draw strong conclusions on. But we're going to use it anyway, right? That's what we're going to do. And, when we talk about who the Falcons could take at 8, I don't think you have to go much further than just kind of looking at the consensus draft rankings of the Falcons, right? And, I think you look at some of the players that the Falcons have taken over the last couple of years, and they haven't strayed that far from what the consensus is. And so I think when you apply that to this year, and if we assume that 3 quarterbacks are going to go in the top 7, I know there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about maybe only 2 teams in the top 7 are going to take quarterbacks. I'll believe that when I see it. But I think we can say with a healthy degree of confidence that we'll get at least 3 quarterbacks in the top 7. That means the Falcons should have their choice of the 5 non-quarterbacks at the top of this draft board. And when you look at the various consensus rankings, those players are Will Anderson, the pass rusher from Alabama, Jalen Carter, the defensive tackle from Georgia, Bijan Robinson, the running back from Texas, Tyree Wilson, the defensive end from Texas Tech, and Christian Gonzalez, a cornerback from Oregon. And I think the odds are pretty high that the Falcons pick is probably going to be one of those 5 players. And again, it's because the Falcons over the previous 2 years did not stray too much from the consensus rate. They're a chalk-based draft team, meaning that it's not to sit here and say that their draft board is exactly like what the consensus rankings are, but it's not that far afield. Like we've talked in the past, if you've been a regular listener to this podcast, you've always heard me say things like the Falcons are going to zig when you expect them to zag. And that was really a testament to the Thomas Dimitroff era Falcons that, how they stacked players on their draft board, especially in the early rounds, is not the same as what the league had. And a lot of the players that the Falcons liked in round 1, most of the league thought, oh, that's a second-round player. Keanu Neal, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, etc. Are some obvious examples that jump out, right? But then when you look at this current regime in the past 2 years, Kyle Pitts and Drake London were kind of chalk guys, right? You look at The Athletic, Arif Hassan, his consensus board that he constructs every year. Looking forward to seeing what he does this year. I don't think he's with The Athletic anymore. But, in 2021, Kyle Pitts was number 2 on the consensus board, looking at like 70 plus draft boards or whatever the number was that Arif broke down to come up with these consensus rankings. Kyle Pitts was number 2, and obvious reasons. That's why he was the best player available. Drake London was number 12. And when the Falcons were on the clock at the 8th overall selection, you look at that consensus rankings, the players left were the number 4 guy that was Kyle Hamilton, the safety out of Notre Dame, Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver at Ohio State, was 10. Jermaine Johnson was 11, the pass rusher out of Florida State, and then Drake London was number 12. And, I think the reasons why the Falcons maybe jumped over some of those players, was because you had the obvious need for the Falcons, the wide receiver, and you had the obvious scheme fit for Drake London over, say, a Garrett Wilson. We saw that Jermaine Johnson, the NFL did not love him as much as basically the draft community ranking that high, where he went 26 in the draft. And obviously the NFL didn't love Kyle Hamilton, in part due to the fact that he was a premium player at a non-premium position, at the safety position, and that's why he fell to 14 where the Ravens got him. And again, not saying that the Falcons are strictly like their board is exactly like the consensus board, but overwhelmingly, when you look at their first picks in the first 3 rounds over the last 2 years, they're not straying that far off the consensus, right? Richie Grant was number 54 on the consensus board. We picked him at 40. Jalen Mayfield was 1 slot below him at 55 on the consensus board. We picked him at 68. Arnold Ebiketie was 34 on the consensus board. We got him at pick 38. Troy Anderson was 69 at pick 58. Desmond Ridder was 42 at pick 74. D'Angelo Malone was 106 at pick 82. Now, when we got into day 3, Drew Dahlman, Darren Hall, Taquan Graham, Justin Schaefer, etc., some of these guys would be considered quote unquote reaches from where they were taken. It was a little bit off the beaten path from consensus, but that's where we had the Falcons taking guys that maybe a round or 2 earlier than where they thought were projected to go. But in the first 3 rounds, that wasn't necessarily the case. Maybe 15 spots or so here or there, but nothing crazy with that. And so, if we're imagining 3 quarterbacks go in the top 7, and then we imagine Will Anderson, right, Jalen Carter, Christian Gonzalez, and Tyree Wilson are the other 4 guys to go in the top 7, that's going to leave Bijan Robinson as the best player available in the draft. And this is why the Bijan Robinson conversation cannot be ignored, I think, by a lot of Falcon fans, because to me, it's a true test over whether or not the Falcons are a best player available drafting team, or is that something that they say they are, right? That's a sort of retroactive thing that they say to justify their pick, as opposed to the idea that they actually are going to take a player that pretty much the consensus says is one of the 5 best players in this draft class. And so if he's there at 8, you would assume that the Falcons would take him if they are truly a best player available draft. But I'm going to say something that's going to shock a lot of you guys. I don't think Bijan Robinson is going to be the pick. I think there's certainly a chance that he's going to be the pick. But if I'm being honest with you, I think there's like a 10, maybe a 15% chance that he's the Falcons pick when it comes. Because I think in this instance, he's going to be the Kyle Hamilton of this year's draft, a premium player at a non-premium position where the Falcons are going to look at other positions. And the player that I think is going to leapfrog Bijan Robinson on the Falcons board is going to be Clemson pass rusher Myles Murphy. And what's interesting about the various consensus boards, right? If you look at the current athletic consensus board that is not done by Arif Hassan, but the one that they, posted, I think earlier this week, Myles Murphy's 9th on that consensus board, right? If you look at the Pro Football Network's consensus board, Myles Murphy is 10th on that consensus board. And I myself have compiled at least 15 draft boards looking at various people's top 50, top 25, top 100, and Myles Murphy is 11th on that list based off of where he's average ranking on those boards. And so again, I think it's a similar conversation that we had a year ago with Drake London, where Bijan's Kyle Hamilton, premium player at a non-premium position that isn't a pressing need for the Falcons. And then when you look at Skoronski and Paris Johnson, who are the other players that are consistently rated ahead of Murphy, right? I don't see the Falcons falling in love with an offensive lineman, right? And then you also have Devin Witherspoon, who is on certain boards is a little bit behind Murphy or slightly ahead of Murphy. But like, to me, Witherspoon is this year's Jermaine Johnson, right? He's a good player, but I don't think he's going to be the top 10 pick based off of historical precedent for that position at cornerback, similar to why Jermaine Johnson was highly touted by a lot of the draft community, but the NFL didn't see him as a premier pass rusher. And while I think the offensive line position is an obvious need, so it makes sense why people think, hey, the Falcons have a opening at left guard. Peter Skoronski makes sense. A lot of people project him rather as a tackle than as a guard in the NFL. And Paris Johnson actually had played right guard at Ohio State prior to moving to left tackle this past year. But I don't see the Falcons taking a tackle convert in round 1 this year. They've converted tackles into guards for 2 years in a row, and it hasn't really worked out with Jalen Mayfield in 2021 and Elijah Wilkinson in 2022. Now, Wilkinson was solid last year, but clearly the Falcons didn't think he was good enough to re-sign, right? And so we've seen this team time and time again when it comes to the offensive line is learn from mistakes, right? They brought in a whole bunch of short-armed offensive linemen in 2021, and then the following year learned from that mistake and brought in a whole bunch of guys with longer arms, right? They drafted Jalen Mayfield in 2021 to be their left guard, despite having no experience as a left guard. And then the following year, who did they draft to push Jalen Mayfield? That was Justin Schaefer, who pretty much all his experience came at the left guard, right? And so when I look at a player like Myles Murphy, to me, he's kind of the Drake London in the event that one of these other premier guys is not on the board. He's the need, the scheme fit. He's also a local guy. He got the coaching connection with Nick Eason at Clemson, with Nick Eason also coaching alongside Arthur Smith in Tennessee. So if we, pretty much assume that the fraudulent Alabama pass rusher doesn't make it out of the top 7, and we also get at least 3 quarterbacks in the top 7, I think those are fairly safe assumptions at this point. We can say with some degree of confidence, right, that the Falcons pick at 8 is going to be, in this particular order is where I would stack it based off of the consensus. Jalen Carter is their top option if they're going to take the best player available. Tyree Wilson is their next best option. Christian Gonzalez is their third option in that order, right? And again, if I'm betting money, it's probably going to come down to Wilson and Gonzalez. That to me is the safe bet. It's going to be one of those 2 guys if they're there. Right. And it probably only seems likely that one of those guys, the odds are one of those guys is going to be there. So it's going to be so obvious to us on Thursday night, come April 27th, who's going to be the pick, because one of those guys could be there. And if they are, they'll be the pick. But it's highly doubtful that both of those guys are there, in my humble opinion. But we'll see. Right. And if all 3 of those guys and Carter, Wilson, and Gonzalez are gone, then I think it's Myles Murphy, and then I think it's Bijan Robinson. And I don't think you have to go deeper than that, guys, for the Falcons pick. And, 3 weeks from now, you'll hear me reacting to who that Falcons first round pick, and I could definitely be wrong. I often say things with my chest on this podcast, but it's not because I believe I know the answers or I have all the answers. It's just because I have compelling reasons for the ways that I think, right? As I've just illustrated, right? And so, oftentimes what happens is, I see other people change their minds about things. Like they'll say one thing in February and then say a completely different thing in April. And I do that too, right? My changing opinion on Devin Witherspoon is a good example of that. I will always explain to you how I got from, say, A to B, as opposed to other people that seem to just kind of wake up and decide, I said A, now I say B, and you wonder. So we could get 2 weeks from now and I could be singing a different tune, but if we are there, I will be on this podcast explaining to you why I changed my opinion. And so that's why I know you guys continue to make this show your first listen, and we'll continue with this first listen, talking a little bit deeper about 2 of these options, Gonzalez and Wilson, and why it makes sense for both of those guys to be the Falcons pick, but why you're probably not going to see me over the next 3 weeks pounding the table for those guys to be, or why they should be the Falcons pick. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode, guys, is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM, and you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game, right? And if you're looking to put your Falcons GM hat on and hire coaches, coordinators, make trades, navigate through free agency, the draft, you can do so in this game. The game world is challenging. It's realistic. It's completely free, playable offline. You can play on the go as you want, whenever you want. And the great thing is you guys can get a 100% free boost when you use the promo code Locked On in the game store in all caps. That's LOCKEDON in all caps. So make sure you check that out today. And if you want to download this game so that you can get your GM hat on, go visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So before we talk about Christian Gonzalez, I do want to go a little bit further in sort of my process in the lead up to the draft. My pre-draft process is, my goal is to know a little bit about a lot of guys. And so oftentimes, much to, I'm sure, some of your frustration, like you'll ask me, who do you think we should take, or who would you take in these situations? And I'm often reluctant to give a definitive answer, because to me, Locked On Falcons, despite, some appearances, is not about, hey, let me show you why I'm the smartest guy in the room and why I'd be the perfect general manager for the Falcons. Although I am flattered from time to time when the handful of you guys do say, you would make a great GM, Aaron. I'm like, oh, I'm so humble. I can't accept that praise. So humble. But, to me, Locked On Falcons is really about It's not about me. It's about you, right? It's about giving you, the information to be informed about the moves that the Falcons actually do make, not the hypothetical ones that I would make, right? And when we talk about what you guys want in this podcast, like I know what you actually want is my thoughts on what the Falcons actually do, because I know that because the most listened to podcast episode every year on the podcast, and if it's not one, it's 2 or 3 every single year, like clockwork, is the Friday episode after round 1. My rapid reaction to whatever the Falcons do on day 1 of the draft. That's an episode that everybody comes to tune in to. And so, like, it's not about, who the Falcons should take. It's about who the Falcons do take. And so when I look at those options, the aforementioned options, right, I don't look at that as, hey, the Falcons should take this guy or whatever. Now, pre-draft, I'm looking at 1 or 2 games. For a lot of top guys, I'm looking at 3 or 4 games. In post-draft, I'll go deeper and dive into the 6 or 8 games. And my opinions pre-draft are sort of initial opinions, right? Knowing a little bit about a lot of guys, and then after the draft, it's knowing a lot about a few guys, the players that the Falcons do draft. And so when you look at a player like Witherspoon, right? My transparency on Devin Witherspoon, right? During the season, I watched 2 games of him on YouTube, right? And I liked the player, thought he was like a middle of the first round player. That was around the time when the Falcons were looking like they were probably going to be picking in the middle of the first round as opposed to the top 10. So it made sense to me. And then after the season in January, started to hear more people talk about him. This is the best cornerback in the draft class. And I'm like, okay, I can get behind that. And part of that is due to my personal opinion on Christian Gonzalez, the Oregon corner, the other guy that's at the top of various people's draft boards at cornerback, is because I'm not in love with Christian Gonzalez like other people are. And then we got around combine time, and I watched one more game of Devin Witherspoon on all 22, and I had some concerns. I'm like, okay, let me hold off on this. Let me get access to more film, which I did get later in March, and watch 2 or 3 more games of him on all 22. And some of the concerns I had in that initial all 22 breakdown, I had watching more and more games. And that's why I have gone from in, late January, early February being like, hey, Devin Witherspoon's going to be the Falcons pick, versus now I'm like, yeah, I don't think he's a top 10 player. Right. That's what I mean, where, I explain how I got from A to B. And so when we talk about Christian Gonzalez, even though I say I don't love the player, right? Again, a lot of this is based off of watching 3 or 4 games. And post-draft, I'll probably wind up watching 6 or 8 games. And maybe through that process of watching more film of him, I'll come around to love the player, right? That happened last year with Arnold Ebiketie. That happened last year with D'Angelo Malone. It wasn't like I disliked those guys or anything like that, although I was very lukewarm on D'Angelo Malone when we initially drafted him. Was less lukewarm on Arnold Ebiketie. It was just like, oh, he's not going to be the Falcons pick because he's going to get picked somewhere in the first round. So I didn't necessarily need a pro or anti-Arnold Ebiketie take. But then as I watch more film, and I'm like, I feel better about these players than I did initially. And so that could happen with Christian Gonzalez. And if he's the pick, I'm not going to sit here and say it's a bad pick, even if I don't necessarily love the player, because the reasons why he makes sense as the Falcons pick is because he looks exactly like what you would draw up a top 10 corner, right? We've talked before about cornerback is a height, weight, speed position when it comes to how high guys get drafted. And when you compare Christian Gonzalez to recent top 10 cornerbacks like Patrick Surtain II, J.C. Horn, Sauce Gardner, Jeff Okudah, Derek Stingley, you take the average measurables of those 5 guys that over the last 3 drafts have been top 10 corners. Their average height was 6'1" 3/8. Christian Gonzalez, 6'1" 3/8. Their average weight was 200 pounds. Christian Gonzalez, 197 pounds. Their average arm length, 32.5 inch, is Christian Gonzalez, 32 inches. Their average 40 speed, 4.43. Christian Gonzalez, 4.38. Their average broad jump, 10 foot 10. Christian Gonzalez, 11'1". So to me, if the Falcons wind up pulling the trigger on Christian Gonzalez at 8, totally makes sense to me, right? You're going to bet on the traits with those guys. And we've seen with those other previous 5 guys, we believe that Patrick Surtain II and Sauce Gardner are going to be good players, very good players in the NFL, arguably 2 of the 5 to 10 best cornerbacks already in the NFL in a limited sample size. We've seen flashes from J.C. Horn. He's been injured a lot, so we need to see more consistency there. That's been the problem with Jeff Okudah. First 2 years in the NFL, very hurt, very inconsistent. Seemed to turn a corner last year. We'll see about that. And we're kind of in a wait and see with Derek Stingley. Scheme fit with him and Lovie Smith didn't make a ton of sense. We'll see if he blossoms under D'Amico Ryans. So if the Falcons wind up drafting Christian Gonzalez, that Friday morning episode that you guys are all tuning into, right? You know, basically, I'm going to spend 30 minutes basically reiterating those points on that episode. Spoiler alert, right? But some of you may have noticed that I only mentioned 5 cornerbacks that were taken in the top 10 over the last 3 years. And you probably know that there's actually been 6 cornerbacks taken in the top 10 in the last 3 years. And I left out CJ Henderson. And the reason why I don't love Christian Gonzalez is because there's a little bit of CJ Henderson in his game to me. Now, full transparency, I was a big fan of CJ Henderson back in the 2020 draft. Loved his athleticism, loved his man coverage traits, right? I liked him as a better prospect than AJ Terrell, even if I thought AJ Terrell was, more the Falcon style of corner. And that's why I ultimately settled on AJ Terrell, predicting him to be the Falcons pick. But the knock on Christian or CJ Henderson was he was a little bit too finesse, lacked effort in the run game, right? Not as physical at the catch point, those types of things. We saw him have a tough year 1 in Jacksonville, get traded to Carolina, and he's essentially been the third corner in Carolina the last 2 seasons. We did see some growth from him this past year, but in terms of living up to the billing of being that top 10 pick, he's fallen short. And part of me wonders, is that due to the fact of the finesse aspect of the game? And to me, Gonzalez has a little bit of that finesse element, not to the degree that I think Henderson had, but in comparison to the other 5 guys that we're talking about that were top 10 picks, right? Nobody watched those other 5 guys and said, those guys aren't physical. Their physicality jumped off the film when you watch those guys in the lead up to those drafts. I don't think that physicality jumps off the film with Christian Gonzalez. And this is why despite everything that's on paper that says Christian Gonzalez looks exactly like a top 10 corner that we've seen in recent memory, this is why I think a lot of people rate Devin Witherspoon, neck and neck with Christian Gonzalez when he doesn't have the height, weight, speed that a typical top 10 corner has. This is why Daniel Jeremiah and Mel Kiper have Witherspoon ranked over Christian Gonzalez on their various boards. I think it's a couple of spots, but right? And so like physicality, competitiveness is what stands out about Devin Witherspoon, not necessarily with Christian Gonzalez. It's athleticism and traits and smoothness and, those types of things. And so that's the one thing that gives me pause of being, going all in on saying, oh, Christian Gonzalez is going to be a great pick. Similar to what Damian Parson of Locked On NFL Draft said on yesterday's episode, talking about how him and, AJ Terrell would be this Revis Camardi, not quite the same level, but, one of the premier cornerback duos in the NFL. And certainly I think that potential is there. But between now and the draft, like you're not going to hear me on this podcast saying that's absolutely going to happen. But I'm not going to push back against anybody else who is pushing that narrative, because I can definitely see the potential there. And maybe once I do the deep dive on Christian Gonzalez after the draft and watch 6, 8 or more games, I'll be, yep, he is closer to Patrick Surtain. He is Patrick Surtain the third, as opposed to CJ Henderson the second, right? And even if he's only like 80% the player that Patrick Surtain is, right? I'll take that. Like, I'm not gonna complain about that guy lining up across from AJ Terrell for the next 4 to 5 years. So, as Shannon Sharp would say, that ain't no problem. That ain't no problem. So we'll see how that all plays out. But he's not going to be necessarily my guy up to that point. So that's where we'll sort of leave the conversation with Christian Gonzalez. Let's turn our attention and basically do the same exercise on Tyree Wilson, right? And why he makes sense for the Falcons at 8. But why I would still also express similar reservations about him as a prospect. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. The NBA playoffs are almost here, guys, and it is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use, or you can head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up and claim your no-sweat first bet, and you can wager from anything from point spreads to money line to threes drain. And if the NBA isn't your speed, head on over to FanDuel and smash that over with the Falcons 7.5 win total this upcoming season. So don't miss your chance for that no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you join FanDuel today. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the main thing when we're talking about Christian or Tyree Wilson is kind of a similar conversation with Christian Gonzalez, right? The selling point on him is you're looking at a player with plus traits. Right now, we don't quite know what Wilson's athletic profile is because he hasn't tested. Right, he's going to have his own personal private workout pro day a little later this month. What the exact date is, we don't know. It was initially reported as mid-April, so probably next week or two, somewhere along those lines. So I'm not expecting him to disappoint when he does test. Right, we know that the NFL, especially in recent years, has coveted bigger athletic defensive ends. We saw that, Trayvon Walker going number one, leapfrogging some more proven pass rushers with teams betting on the traits last year. And, a fun fact is Kayvon Thibodeau, one of those players that Trayvon Walker leapfrog, is the only sub 260-pound edge rusher that has been taken in the top 10 since 2016 when Leonard Floyd was taken in the top 10. And so clearly the NFL is pushing towards bigger, faster, stronger defensive ends in recent drafts, right? So if you take over the last 5 drafts since Leonard Floyd, you look at the top 10 edge rushers taken in those 5 drafts, their average height was 6'4.5", 266 pounds, 33 and 7 3/4 inch arms, right? A 40 speed of 4.65, a 3 cone of 7.09, and a broad jump of 10 feet. And you look at a player like Tyree Wilson, who comes in significantly bigger and longer than that, 6'6", 271 pounds, 35 and 5/8 inch arms. And right, we'll see how he tests. I'm expecting his 3 cone to be probably a little bit higher than 7.09, maybe like 7.15, somewhere in that range. Right. But I do think he'll probably run faster than a 4.65, and he'll probably jump further than a 10-foot broad jump. Now, assuming that he does test like that, then we're talking about, from an athletic standpoint, from a size standpoint, we're talking about a similar athlete as guys like Jadeveon Clowney, Ziggy Ansah, both of whom were top 7 picks, I think, in the draft. And so you understand why an NFL team is willing to bet on that type of profile year after year after year. And the Falcons make total sense to bet on that profile because that profile is kind of the ideal heir apparent to Calais Campbell, who's basically a 1-year rental. And the idea is if you plot, Wilson on one side of the line, you have Ebiketie on the other side of the line, that's 2 potential bookend pass rushers for many, many years to come. And we've talked in the past about how the Falcons, might be on the cusp of getting 40 sacks for the first time since 2004. And, 40 sacks would be an average pass rush. And to clarify, it's not to say that the Falcons haven't had a league average pass rush at any point in the last 19 seasons. It's just that, nowadays, 40 sacks is the average nowadays, right? In 2016 and 2017, the average NFL defense in terms of sacks was closer to 35. And in both of those years, the Falcons had 34 and 39 sacks. So they had league average pass rush in those 2 seasons. But the point is, moving forward, we haven't seen that type of pass rush in the past. And so, you look back, not fully 20 years, but 17 years, basically since 2006, the Falcons have been looking for these bookend edge rushers for 17 years now, right? It started when they had Patrick Kearney and they brought in John Abraham, and then Kearney departed. They drafted Jamal Anderson. He didn't work out. They replaced Jamal Anderson with Ray Edwards. He didn't work out. They got rid of John Abraham. They bring in, Vic Beasley, and a couple of years later, they bring in Tack McKinley. They don't work out. They replace Beasley with Fowler. That didn't work out. And so now we're back here with Ebiketie looking for his bookend pass rusher across from him. And it remains to be seen, while we can sit here and be hopeful, it remains to be seen if Ebiketie or that new guy like a Tyree Wilson are going to work out. And so, look, there's some people listening to this podcast right now, who you are, Gary, right? That in 2006, you were changing diapers. And now in 2023, your son, your daughter is ready to graduate from high school, right? It's an entire lifetime right now. Someone has grown up before your eyes since the Falcons have had that good bookend pair of pass rushers. And I'm sure that makes you feel old. Welcome to my world, right? But we're back here again, searching, right? And clearly it hasn't worked up to this point. And I get why. That's probably why a lot of people are hesitant. Like, we're going to do this again. I feel like we've been down this road so many times and it never works out for the Atlanta Falcons. But, and when you look at a player like Tyree Wilson, I can understand even greater hesitance because he's a project. He's an unrefined pass rusher. He's got the tools, but he's not there yet. And it may take the better part of 3 years for him to get there, and he may never get there. Right. And it goes back to something I said to Keith Sanchez earlier this week. On the podcast, talking about comparing Tyree Wilson similarly to someone like a Jadeveon Clowney, right? And the knock on Clowney has been, despite all the talent that we all recognize he had coming into the league, 8-9 years ago, right? He's never been that sort of alpha pass rusher. He's been more of a high end beta, to use the popular parlance. I'm not going to say shout out to Andrew Tate, but you know what I'm saying? Like, no shout out to Andrew Tate, but you know what I'm saying? Like, he's not an alpha. He's more of a beta pass rusher. If we can use that parlance without, getting into all the other stuff, if you get what I'm saying. Now maybe Wilson's better than that. Maybe he's worse than that. We'll see. Right. But if the Falcons draft him, I'm not going to be complaining, because I'm going to hope and pray that he's going to be better than that he's going to be that alpha. Right. And basically, even though the Falcons have a history of striking out, trying to do this with these edge rushers and these pass rushers, you got to keep taking swings. It's not going to work. It's not going to magically show up and, Myles Garrett and Aaron Donald are going to show up tomorrow and be like, hey, you know what? We just decided that we want to play for the Atlanta Falcons. We're going to solve all your problems. So they got to take swings. And my hope is that with Onyemata, here for another 2 years, we've talked before about how Grady Jarrett, you can probably expect 2 more peak years from him at least. You got Arnold Ebiketie hoping to make a year 2 jump. You got Campbell here for a rental. You got Carter. You got, D'Angelo Malone. You got Taquan Graham. You got all these guys, right? You don't necessarily need Tyree Wilson to come in and light the world on fire right away. And so it buys you a little bit of time. And hopefully, he can tag team with Ebiketie and Onyemata and Jarrett as a quality foursome for the next couple of years. And it makes me optimistic about the future of this team and the future of this pass rush, because I'm hoping that this current regime is going to be different from the previous regime that got very complacent when it came to pass rushers. When they drafted Beasley and Jarrett and Takk McKinley, and we're like, we're done. We've solved the pass rush problem. They didn't, right? Like, I feel like this regime is going to continue to take swings, right? The Saints did it when Nielsen was there. Every year that Nielsen was there, the Saints drafted a pass rusher. Now, some of those guys like Zach Bond and Caden Ellis moved to linebacker, but every year they drafted somebody that their job in college football was to get after the quarterback. And I'm hoping that we will see a similar trend moving forward. Now, we'll see what my floor ceiling comps for Tyree Wilson is going to be after the draft, once I do my deep dive, if I have to do a deep dive on him, if he's the Falcons pick. But for the moment, let's say it's Jadeveon Clowney, right? And again, that's not an alpha. That's not a lead dog, so to speak, right? But I sit here and I go, if you put Clowney on one side, and then on the other side you have Ebiketie, and let's use my ceiling comp for him was DeMarcus Lawrence, is that a bad combination? Maybe that's not, 2 alphas. Maybe that's 2 betas, right? 2 guys that are more likely to get 6 to 8 sacks per year versus 10 to 12 sacks every year. But that, to me, establishes a solid foundation for you at the edge rusher position. Obviously, in the future, with an aging Jarrett and Onyemata, you're going to have to find a replacement for them. But I feel like you're starting at a better point with those 2 guys, with a Clowney, with a Lawrence, with an Ebiketie / Wilson, than you are from some of the past choices that the Falcons have made. And that gives me hope and optimism for the future. So to me, the selling point on Tyree Wilson is less about, hey, he an individual is going to solve all the Falcons pass rush problems. Maybe he does. Of course, the potential is there. But it's, and of course, you feel good about Ryan Nielsen's development potential, or at least you feel optimistic about Ryan Nielsen's ability to develop that type of player out of him. But at the same point, it's really about the Falcons are investing in this area that we have not seen them reliably and successfully invest in the past. And so the next decade will not be as devoid of pass rush moving forward as it has been for the last 2 decades. And so we'll see what paths the Falcons ultimately go down when it comes to this draft, right? Like, I could certainly see one path where they go, Christian Gonzalez in round 1 and take Georgia Tech defensive end Keon White in round 2, or they go Tyree Wilson in round 1 and they take South Carolina cornerback Cam Smith in round 2. And I'm for either path, right? Now, of course, now I say that, they'll take Peter Skoronski in round 1, and then they'll take like Iowa tight end Sam Laporta in round 2. And, I'm not going to sit here and tell you right now that's a bad path, but let's just say after the draft, I'll have to do a lot more diving into the film before I can really sell you on that plan moving forward. Right. So again, let's assume that they take edge rusher corner in rounds 1 and 2. Round 3, probably a wide receiver. Right. I'd like to believe it's a speed guy like Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati, or Marvin Mims out of Oklahoma, and Jaden Reed out of Michigan State. But knowing the Falcons, they'll get like a big guy. They'll get Cedric Tillman out of Tennessee, or A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest, or Rashee Rice out of SMU. right? And then round 4, that maybe they address their offensive line issues. Nick Broker, the guard from Ole Miss. Ryan Hayes is probably going to be the tackle out of Michigan. We'll see how it all goes. And then, they'll take a linebacker and a running back and a D tackle or something, safety or something like that, at the end of day 3, something along those lines. So we'll see how it all goes, guys. But, we'll be talking a little bit more about possible options for the Falcons in round 1. And probably our next mock draft Monday is probably going to be Nolan Smith, right? And as I clearly laid out on today's episode, I don't think Nolan Smith is going to be the pick, but let's spend mock draft Monday talking about it. So that will be what your first listen will be at the beginning of next week, and then I think we'll have a lot of guests on next week. We'll probably have Mark Schofield on to talk quarterbacks, and we'll have some people that cover the Falcons, Falcon fans, whatever you want to call them. We'll talk about some of the players that they like at some of these positions. And so we'll get into that all next week. So lots of great draft related content. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the draft dudes, where Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino are taking you through what it takes to build a successful NFL franchise each and every day. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the draft dudes on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Guys, have a great weekend.